Joining us for the rest of the hour is Greg Palast, and of course he's a best-selling author, written for the BBC, written for London Guardian, you name it, ABC News. I mean, I remember they put an arrest warrant out after Katrina under Homeland Security saying he was showing secret installations, and it was on the news. It was an arrest warrant out for him because they have under the Patriot Act saying if you report on sensitive installations, this was a toxic waste dump, you can be arrested. And I thought, my gosh, is this real? I went and looked it up. There it was. And he's one of the few people in mainstream media who will actually tell it like it is. Though, I mean, he attacks the left and the right. He's a former federal fraud investigator. And he goes after the whole system. And I had him on the other night, riveting interview on the TV show. But since we've talked and so much is going on, what is number one on your radar? I've got my questions. You hear me here ranting about all of this. But what is number one on your radar?
Well, Alex, I would say number one on my radar is the end of democracy. And it's ending where it began in Greece. The bankers have now decided that they have the right to appoint presidents and prime ministers, and they're being applauded by the mainstream press from the New York Times and of course the European Union, etc. So you have an economics professor who was a bank advisor in the U.S. I'm not even sure you could call him Greek. He had Greek parents, was born in Greece, is now the so-called Prime Minister of Greece. You have Monti, Carlo Monti, who is now been appointed Prime Minister of Italy. Again, not elected. So the cradle of democracy and Italy, not elected. You're going to see this all over the place. So-called caretaker technocrat
We're already seeing it in Michigan and Rhode Island and New Jersey and all over, where they're taking over even major cities, like in RoboCop or something, and saying the corporation runs things now. The city signs on to fraud and derivatives that weren't there. They double, triple prices on everything, and then turn the street lights off. I mean, this is what they did in Argentina.
Yeah, and except that in Argentina, the people rose up and they went into the streets and they told the IMF to go stick it where the banks don't shine. And now their economy's growing at 8% a year. They told the bankers to forget it. You're not, J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, that gang is not allowed to operate. Not allowed to operate in Argentina or Brazil. Those economies are booming. They never got poisoned by the toxic derivatives once they threw these guys out, and that's what's happening.
In every case, you let these vampires in, they're going to suck you dry.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of Argentina, for example, they're required to privatize the water systems just as we're doing here. They sold off the Buenos Aires water system to Enron after Jeb Bush made a personal call to the president of Argentina, Menem, and said, my daddy's about to become president. This is when Bush Sr. was coming in, and he would appreciate it if you would turn over the water system to Enron. And it's not like Menem had any scruples. And the pressure was on, and he turned it over. And of course, they ended up with 400% increase in the price of water, and then no water, and then the company with the water evaporated. But that's the pattern. They tried it there, then they bring it here. They tried it in Latin America, then they bring it over to Europe. I mean, you just talked about what's happening in Greece. I call Greece a crime scene. It's not a nation where people were profligate and they're a bunch of lazy, ouzo-swilling, olive pit spitting Greeks that just hang around and retire when they're teenagers. That's the baloney you get from the press. These are hardworking people. They have very long work hours, much longer than Germany, by the way, officially. The problem is that their banking system was looted by an agreement between the last two governments, both their big parties, and Goldman Sachs. It was just looted.
Well, their finance ministers and presidents were all Goldman Sachs people.
Yeah. And what they had was there was a deal. And I discussed this in my book, Vulture's Picnic. There was a deal to hide the deficit of Greece through a currency swap arrangement with Goldman Sachs. Goldman, on paper, took a multi-billion-dollar loss, which Goldman never deliberately takes a multi-billion-dollar loss on anything. It was a phony, and there's a secret agreement to pay them back at usurious interest rates, plus they got a $500 million fee. This is a fraud. Nice work, by the way, for some flim-flam currency paper. This is a fraud upon the market. When I was a fraud investigator for the government, when we used to actually, put people in prison for that type of thing. I mean, that's what we did. It's a violation. It used to be considered a violation of racketeering laws. But when you do it in coordination with the heads of state secretly of another government, they're not going to be touched. They're not going to be touched. But what happened was when it was discovered that there was nothing left in the Greek treasury that had been looted in this manner, of course, they've had to now pay interest rates of 15, 16%. And the economy's imploded. No one could pay that. If your mortgage went up by 400%, you know, it's not that you're being profligate. You're being jacked. It's a crime scene.
Well, no, it's loan sharking. And the IMF World Bank documents that you broke in 2002 was them internally admitting it's predatory, as if we need them to admit it to us. But here is the signed, sealed confession. But expanding on that, what do you make of Moody's, S&P, and others, all financed and run by the big 6 mega banks, or the big 5, as you call them, that, you know, Geithner said, you know, admits he serves. I want to talk about, is it 5 or 6?
Yeah.
And now they're going out, when it's the banks that are insolvent through fraud, they've gotten government to sign on to too big to fail by threatening to implode the economy, holding us hostage. And so the very people that are actually the ones that are insolvent are now telling the governments and the people we're insolvent, and have their ratings agencies that certify their crud as AAA gold now decertifying and lowering things for governments so they get higher interest rates on them. I mean, how obvious is that?
Well, look at it this way. Do you realize that the Fed window is lending money to the banks at 1/4% interest? The European Central Bank just lent out 2/3 of $1 trillion to European banks at 1% interest. They then turn around and invested in government bonds, which are guaranteed by you and me, at 4%, 5%, and 6%. That's a good business. Not investing in housing, not investing in businesses, not investing in building the economy. They're literally taking our money at 1/4 to 1% interest and returning and literally picking up 200-300% returns. It is astonishing. It's just a churn of this cash. American banks today went from $2 billion in cash reserve assets in 2007 to nearly $2 trillion today. $2 billion to $2 trillion. They're sitting on cash. Where they get the cash? They got it from you and me, from the open Fed window.
And then they lectured us about how we're lazy scum, and they got to turn the street lights off, and we got to pay more taxes because we're lazy, and they got to take the police and firemen's pension funds because that's welfare now too. Total bull, and their plan is to bankrupt us. It's amazing. The book is Vulture's Picnic. Excellent. Available at bookstores everywhere, gregpalast.com. I'm going to give the toll-free number out to discuss what's happening in Greece, to discuss what's happening here in the United States, because you better believe, you think this recession going into depression is bad, the bankers on record say they plan on imploding us, because then they buy stuff up even cheaper. They mass all the wealth, have government regulators shut down their competition. I've got to call this fascism, but because it's global, people go, but isn't fascism nationalistic? The manifestation of fascism in the 30s and 40s was. This is not. What would you call this, Greg Palast? Corporate fascism or corporate crony kleptocracyism? What's your term?
The answer would be yes on that. Actually, the technical term meaning of fascism, and I've read Mussolini's works, by the way, is a combination of government and corporate governance, which they consider good, as they say, wealth creators taking over. Yeah, technically it is fascism, because when you have banks appoint the presidents, that's the actual technical definition of fascism. So indeed, that's what it is. What we have in Greece, and what we're going to see here when they're getting rid of so-called entitlements. And by the way, the reason they're called entitlements is you're entitled to it. You paid insurance you've paid for your Social Security. That happens to be your account. You've paid for your Medicare. That's an insurance plan.
Well, they announced 2 weeks ago they've already raided most of the federal pension funds and put IOUs in there. I mean, this is going to destroy total confidence. And in their plan, as you know, Greg, it doesn't even get us out of the hole. It's designed to impoverish us.
Yes, and in fact, what we see in Europe now is that the guys who set the fire, like I say, Greece is a crime scene. We see it in Italy, Portugal, Spain. Now it's moving into Finland, Hungary, and across to the UK, Ireland. What's happening is the guys who set the fires are picking up all the property at the fire sales. I mean, the Germans right now, German industries and the wealthy of Germany are doing to Greece what their Panzer divisions couldn't do, which is basically a full-scale takeover.
Well, they're right,
So,
and the Greeks are pointing that out. But you're absolutely right. They're doing through economic conquest and by a stealthier mode what Napoleon couldn't do.
yeah, and what we're going to see in the U.S. Is privatizations. We just saw today both parties in Congress have agreed to put up spectrum for sale to AT&T, Verizon. The big boys will own the entire spectrum. It used to be public airwaves. It was something we own, and the reason is that we are have a desperate deficit problem. So we're going to be selling off the family jewels.
In the high def radio spectrum that opened up dozens and dozens of channel spaces in talk radio, this is something I know about, they're giving almost none of them to even local mom and pops or community stations. It's all to the mega corporations to put canned comedy on or nothing. I mean, so absolutely that's happening as well, and they will not give it to local community stations.
Yeah, and a lot of it is you're going to see secure private corporate networks, like the Coke Industries has its own secure communication system. So you're going to see basically corporations set up kind of an internal communications and intelligence operations of their own. And that's where the spectrum will go. It's very, but again, they're selling off public property, public right. How else are you going to keep the banks on this churn? As I said, and when we talk about the destruction being part of the plan, as I said, when I got these documents from inside the IMF and the World Bank and the WTO, which I show in Vulture's Picnic, I didn't just say, it could have been junk, it could have been made up stuff that I pulled off some crazy site or something, but it wasn't. I got it inside, but I had to get it confirmed. I went to the head of the WTO, Pascal Lamy, and he confirmed the authenticity of my documents. So did Joe Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, who was chief economist for the World Bank. He didn't give me any documents, but he was willing to confirm their authenticity, and I took them even to some heads of state. And one of the things that I went over with Stiglitz, which shocked me, it said it looks like they're actually figuring on destruction and riots in these plans. Like if there are riots, like we had in Greece, the bank burnings, like we had in Argentina, riots in the streets, in Ecuador, that then gives the excuse to bring the tanks into the street. There's repression. There's then a caretaker, so-called caretaker government, in other words, appointed government. Then they sell off the properties. So it's kind of in the plan, the destruction.
Well, yeah, that drives down the prices, and it's all right there in the plan. And they're announcing global private corporate government where they appoint your leaders in Italy, in Greece. They're moving towards that in Ireland. They tried that in Iceland. I want to ask you about Iceland when we get back. I want to look at the war front, internet censorship, and calls. Straight ahead with Greg Palast. I'm Alex Jones. Sensitive installations. This was a toxic waste dump. You can be arrested. And I thought, my gosh, is this real? I went and looked it up. There it was. And he's one of the few people in mainstream media who will actually tell it like it is. Though, I mean, he attacks the left and the right. He's a former federal, fraud investigator. And he goes after the whole system. And I had him on the other night, riveting interview on the TV show. But since we've talked and so much is going on, what is number one on your radar? I've got my questions. You hear me here ranting about all of this. But what is number one on your radar?
Well,
selling author, written for the BBC, written for London Guardian, you name it, ABC News. I mean, I remember they put an arrest warrant out after Katrina under Homeland Security saying he was showing secret installations, and it was on the news. There was an arrest warrant out for him because they have under the Patriot Act saying if you report on...
Alex, I would say number one on my radar is the end of democracy. And it's ending where it began in Greece. The bankers have now decided that they have the right to appoint presidents and prime ministers, and they're being applauded by the mainstream press from the New York Times and of course.
Joining us for the rest of the hour is Greg Palast, and of course he's the best